Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Chatham House event on power and democracy in northern Nigeria. And I would just like to welcome our speakers. As I said, Lina was a researcher with us last year. She's currently the Marie Curie Fellow at the Center for Population, Poverty and Public Policy Studies in Luxembourg. She is the author of this paper, and her research focuses on Nigerian political history, neo-patrimonialism, cross-border trade in West Africa, post-colonial perspectives on African politics, democratic politics and elections in Africa more broadly. She was a postgraduate teaching assistant at the Center for West African Studies at the University of Birmingham between 2005 and 2007. And between 2001 and 2003, she was assistant superintendent of investigations for the Independent Corrupt Practices Commission in Abuja. We're also joined today by Dr. Abdul Raufu Mustafa. He's a lecturer in African politics at the University of Oxford. He's also a member of the editorial advisory group for the Review of African Political Economy and the Board of Trustees of the Development Research and Projects Center in Kano, Nigeria. Raufu is the lead researcher on the Islam Research Project funded by the Dutch Foreign Ministry. He previously also worked for the Working Group on Ethnic Minorities, the UN Commission on Human Rights, and the Project on Ethnic Structure and Public Sector Governance for the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development in Geneva. So Lina's going to talk for about 15 minutes discussing the findings of her research and this report, and then Raufu, as respondent, will speak for another 8 to 10 minutes. So welcome, Lina, over to you. Oh, and just a quick reminder, yes, this meeting is on the record. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Lizzie, and thank you for coming. Early last year, I started working with Chatham House on a project that was focused on looking at the implications of changing politics and power relations in northern Nigeria on national unity and regional stability. And out of that has come this paper, which looks at the effects of democratization and pacted politics on northern Nigeria and the wider governance challenges of the region. So the intention of this paper was to provide some background and some context for the transformations we have been seeing in the north of Nigeria over the past decade and a half. For a region that has never really attracted this scale of interest, particularly the current focus on insurgency violence in the north of the country, we think it's particularly necessary to put the cacophony of demands rising out of the region and the mesh of contentions for influence, inclusion, opportunity, and representation within a suitable frame. So this is particularly important because we have, in the past few months and weeks even, seen a breathtaking surge in the violence in the north. And this has only added to anxieties over the condition Nigeria will be in when it holds its next election in about 7 months. Many of the frustrations and the fractures in regional and religious relations that were manifested in riots and protests across the north after the last presidential election in 2011 still remain and seem to have deepened and widened over the past 3 years. There is still widespread frustration in the north with the lack of democratic dividends, especially as living conditions for most northerners have worsened and quite dramatically. And there's a general sense that with each electoral cycle, the government has seemed to move further and further away from the people. So in this report, we highlight the fact that 16 out of the 19 northern states have seen their rates of poverty double since the 1980s. And despite Nigeria's new status as the biggest economy in Africa, the gap between Nigeria's economic growth and social welfare indicators has widened considerably, especially for northerners. This report argues that despite the north's big development challenges and worsening security, the region's political leaders have conflated demands for more economic opportunities and better democratic representation with demands for presidential power to be returned to the north. So, in place of a consolidation of democracy, Nigeria has experienced more of a consolidation of the issue of power rotation, and the failure of northern leaders to control presidential power for even a single term since Nigeria returned to democracy has caused frustrations in their political strategies and strongly defined Nigeria's political discourses and discourse and experiences for the past 15 years. So Nigeria's return to democracy in 1999 is an important departure point for this report, because the shift of presidential power from northern to southern Nigeria altered Nigeria's regional relations in quite significant ways. For much of Nigeria's political history, northern-dominated political networks have been more successful at controlling national power. And this success was a product of a very practical kind of politics that was demonstrated in a greater willingness to bargain and accommodate the interests and agendas of influential people from the Middle Belt and from the south of the country. However, the greater influence that northern leaders have had on national affairs in Nigeria has historically caused tensions between the north and the south, and was a foremost issue when Nigeria returned to democracy in 1999. And over the course of Nigeria's 15 years of democratizing, the report highlights the succession of elite pacts that have been used to manage the balance of power between Nigeria's regions and questions their long-term effectiveness. It argues that although the retention of presidential power in the south of the country has integrated a greater number of southern elites into national networks of power, it has failed to produce an effective and a popular framework for how political power, national resources, and revenue ought to be distributed between Nigeria's diverse regions. So in quite significant and tangible ways, Nigeria's return to civilian rule complicated rather than resolved many of the sticking points in its politics. A significant issue that remains unresolved is the different paces at which the North and South are developing, and you can add to that now democratizing. So now Nigeria's political processes are being dominated by debates over the rightness of power rotation and not by important issues of strengthening democratic institutions or improving the decision-making processes of political parties. We have South-South elites arguing that it's their turn to hold on to power for at least 2 presidential terms, the way the Southwest did, and Northern elites saying they haven't had a proper go yet. And at the regional level, this report looks at how Northern leaders have reacted to their loss of power at the center. And it argues that some Northern actors attach their political agendas and strategies to demands for a greater role for Sharia law. And these demands have remained under the surface of Northern society for many decades. However, the adoption of Sharia criminal law in 12 Northern states fell below the popular expectations of many of those who welcomed its return. There was a sense that the issue of expanding Sharia law was politically manipulated. This was not only in the way the law was implemented, but in the degree of caution that was shown by the then Obasanjo government in challenging its constitutionality and conformity with human rights law, international human rights law. Yet, after Sharia was expanded from Zamfara to Borno, as poverty, social injustice, and unemployment got worse, people's confidence in the political leadership and in the quality of representation they were getting weakened. Growing distrust towards governments, a lack of government presence, and severe underdevelopment opened up the North's social space for extreme religious ideologies to be seeded and for older ones to be revived. So this report argues that it is this context that has contributed to the resilience of the Boko Haram threat. And this report also stresses that the Boko Haram insurgency is a homegrown problem, despite its regional and international dimensions. And it will be an uphill task for the federal government to contain the insurgency without addressing its own significant competency and legitimacy gap at the local level. Nigeria's security forces, Nigeria's security forces cannot go around the need to prioritize local expectations of justice. And this report also highlights the substantial capacity of state governors to make concrete and visible changes at the state level. Although the federal allocations being given to northern governors are about 50% of what goes to the oil-rich Niger Delta, the federal revenue that has gone to the north in the past 15 years is the most the region has ever received. So this makes for very big expectations of northern governors to make substantive investments in infrastructure, in education, and job creation. This report argues that many in the north feel that the poor performance of state and local governments in these areas has contributed to democracy's weak consolidation in the region. In this report, we also say that northern leaders have again invested too much of their energies over the past 15 years in challenging the fairness of the current formula of revenue allocation, which gives 13% of oil revenues to the oil-producing states according to the derivation principle. There has been less of a concentration of effort on the part of the northern governors on real initiatives to revive the region's economy and encourage new sources of income. So in terms of governance challenges, the North's political leadership have failed to adjust their priorities in a way that reflects an understanding of their capacities and the importance of meeting the needs of their populations. Too much of the very little political leverage the North had when Nigeria returned to democracy was expended on wrangling with southern elites over oil revenues and on regaining the presidency. Precious little has been spent on addressing the region's actual development challenges. And in this discussion of the role of state governors, this report points to the 19 northern governors who will be inaugurated in May of next year as the key state actors that will have a longer-term role in addressing the region's development challenges. Only 7 of the current governors are eligible for re-election next year, so this would be the biggest turnover of governors the region has had since 1999. So the new and second-term governors will be responsible for implementing the kind of ambitious and long-term solutions the region needs. In the report, we also highlight the various state and regional level alliances that, if properly focused, can work more productively with the federal government and coordinate and implement solutions to the region's common problems with unemployment, low literacy, and poor health and social services. And probably a few more points that I would have wished we had greater breadth to look at in the report, and I'll just mention these as I conclude. Are the points about the North really immense capacity to move itself away from the current status quo. And this capacity is in the region's agricultural potential, human capital potential, and the mineral resources in the region, as well as a foundational sense of cohesion that, if brought together, can form the basis of a revived economy for the region. And I'll just read a bit of the text is the same text that's repeated through all the posters. And I think they capture something of the sense of, as much as this was an aspirational time for the region as well, but you do see development, you see a region who had a certain understanding of its capacity. And this is some of the text from the posters. In northern Nigeria, the system of modern parliamentary democracy is strengthened by the oldest and most efficient local government system in Africa. This ensures a high degree of order and stability for which the region is noted, and which makes it so safe for foreign investors. It has made possible rapid strides taken in economic expansion in recent years, as the confidence which the outside world has in northern Nigeria finds concrete expression in the form of private investments, grants, loans, and various forms of economic help and cooperation. And after a big description about the topography, it goes on to say this: here live the Hausa, the Fulani, Kanuri, Nupe, Tiv, Yoruba, and a host of smaller tribes, all different and yet united as one people with a common purpose and a common destiny, a warm and a friendly people in a warm and a friendly land. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Lina, and congratulations on your publication. And thank you for just a really good summary of actually laying out the frustrations on the one hand of the elite, of the politicians in their efforts to balance power, but certainly each with their own view of how that should work and what their interests are. And then on the other hand, frustrations that you see in the social space and what that is doing in terms of providing opportunities for these radical ideologies to take root. One of the things that really drew us to this project and that drove us to apply for this Iranda Foundation funding for it was that we saw that increasingly decision makers were grappling with complex crises emanating from the north. And it was really an effort to bring more nuanced information to discussions, particularly around security, and provide a broader view of the northern Nigerian context in light of discussions, particularly within Nigeria, that you see, and especially this year as Nigeria celebrates its centenary of national unity. But Raufu, I'd like for you to respond now, please, to Lina's report. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Lina. Lina's report I found very interesting. I completely agree with the political judgment that she has to exercise all along. So I think the politics of it is very good. I think also the style is quite very engaging, very direct, and quite, so those are the two main things I liked about the report. And I think it does give us a good handle to try to understand some of the dilemmas facing the politicians and the public policy people in northern Nigeria and in Nigeria more generally. So in that sense, I think it's a very useful contribution to grappling with these very challenging times we have. The issues I'd like to raise, in a sense, they are somewhat outside of the remit of what you set out to do, but they are nevertheless related to it. And I think they help us to better appreciate what you are trying to do. The first thing is to try to tie up all the individual issues that were raised and the judgment that was correctly passed on them into a trend. I think that sense of trend is missing. And that actually is very important because it tells you, you tell us northern politicians feel threatened and marginalized, but we don't quite know why and where it's coming from. And the impression one gets is that somehow that comes from 1999. Actually, it goes well before then. So that's the whole purpose of, if you put a kind of a trend analysis into what you've done, we'll begin to appreciate that 1999 was just another chapter in a long-run process. We'll begin to understand Boko Haram and religious extremism, not just in terms of rising poverty, which is true, but also another long-run process of religious reform. And then we can understand also, you seem to place a lot of expectation on northern governors as a solution. And I don't think that's going to be quite an appropriate strategy. So trying to understand the trends seems to me to be important in pointing us in the direction we need to go by way of solutions. And that means we must understand, for instance, why northern elites put so much stock on political power. It's not just a cultural thing coming from the caliphate system and the exercise and the learning the mechanics of power in that context. It's also, if you like, almost a rational response to a federation in which they were going to be at a disadvantage unless they found a lever that they could control. They didn't have the educated people to run the bureaucracies. They didn't have the economic power. They didn't have the infrastructure, but they had the population. It was logical in the 50s, 40s, and 50s to try to convert that population size into political power, which was what they did. And for most of the history of the North, in that period, the political elite was conscious of the need to use that power to better the region. But after the coup in 1966, there was a disjuncture in the North. The political elite kept on trying to hold on to that power, but no longer for a collective common good, but for a narrower class individual. And that's where the problem comes, essentially. So if Northerners today feel marginalized and alienated from political power, it's partly because the one thing they could conceivably hold on to in that federation is slipping away. And it's slipping away in the context in which you have 7% growth over 10 years, you have all sorts of foreign direct investment, and all of it concentrated in one part of the country, as you very rightly pointed out. So economic power, infrastructural power, everything that matters, and political power now will then move away. And I think that is the context in which some of the sense of anxiety comes. And I think you need to put it in that historical trend context to be able to appreciate it. It's not just that people are being hungry for power. No doubt some of them are. But there's a deeply felt sense of lacking nothing in a context in which these groups still matter. Now, that brings me also to the issue of the trends in extreme religious. You tied very correctly to poverty, current poverty, and I think that's true. Poverty has escalated massively in the North, particularly amongst the youth, along with unemployment. But the fact is that religious extremism has been there in the North at least since the 70s. People trying to outbid each other in terms of their religious credentials, trying to not just say they stand for a particular idea, which is fair enough, because there's religious freedom, presumably, But somehow it's not enough to say that my religious ideas are important. I have to destroy your own. And it's that sense of intolerance which I think predates 1999, and it's been there. And what this means, what this means, for instance, is that poverty alleviation alone is not going to solve the problem of religious extremism in the North. There has to be an internal debate amongst Muslims about religion, about civic rights of people. And I think we lose that if we focus too much on the poverty. And now when you talk about the northern governors, all the important levers of Nigerian society, they don't control them. They control a lot of money. They could make a difference, but issues of security, electricity, transport infrastructure, agricultural tariffs, all the key things. So we cannot expect too much from these governors. They will be able to do some things. What we need is a much more comprehensive strategy, including the federal government, the international partners, the northern governments, the communities, to try and shift those northern communities away from the path in which they are set now. And with respect to, say, the issue of religious extremism, I think it's largely a domestic debate amongst Muslims that needs to be encouraged. And so my major thing that I would have liked to see is this trend historical analysis to join up the dots that you so well articulate in different potted plants, as it were. Now, I have two very quick things to point out by way of conclusion. You pointed out that the agricultural transformation agenda agriculture is growing in Nigeria. They are taking a number of innovative approaches to agricultural issue. And you seem to be complaining that not enough resources is being put into agriculture. Actually, that's a problem, yes. The more important problem from the point of view of the North, in my view, is that the strategy of agricultural development that is being promoted is premised on disengaging the peasantry from agricultural resources and concentrating these resources in the hands of those they say agriculture is no longer a way of life, it's a business. So foreign interests, domestic interests, there are about 20 or 25 of them, I don't have the list here, who have massive investments in agriculture. It basically means taking these peasants away from the land and turning this land over, which means this current agricultural strategy is actually likely to lead to more problems, not less, in the North. And finally, a lot has been going on in the national conference, which relate directly to what you are trying to say. I don't know when you did the paper, but clearly I think this is an opportunity missed in terms of what's happening at the national conference. It's just more of the same, and that could have been an opportunity where some of these things could have been addressed. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafi.